I found my wife's secret diary, and everything we built together instantly collapsed. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I was pulling bloody fiberglass insulation out of the drywall when I found the exact date my wife decided to destroy my life. The house we lived in was a monument to our success, a hypermodern, minimalist concrete fortress perched above the rain-swept city. It was supposed to be impenetrable, but a minor, persistent leak behind the master bathroom vanity had forced me to take a heavy masonry hammer to my own flawless design. The air was thick with the alkaline stench of crushed plaster and ancient, stagnant moisture. My forearms burned with physical exhaustion as I swung the heavy iron tool, feeling the satisfying, brutal crunch of the drywall giving way. I reached deep into the dark, jagged cavity, expecting to find a corroded copper pipe or a failed PVC joint. Instead, my scarred knuckles brushed against something entirely foreign. It was a heavy rectangular object, meticulously wrapped in thick, industrial-grade black plastic and sealed tightly with duct tape. It felt like a brick, but the weight was wrong. I pulled it out into the harsh, cold glare of the halogen work light. The plastic was covered in a thick layer of fine, gray dust. I grabbed my utility knife and sliced through the synthetic skin. Inside lay a thick, black leather-bound notebook. It wasn't a standard planner. It was the kind of archival ledger used for permanent, immutable records. I opened it, the brittle, cream-colored pages crackling sharply in the dead silence of the empty house. The handwriting belonged to Sylvia, my brilliant, charismatic wife who managed the prestigious architectural firm we had supposedly built together. But this wasn't a diary of feelings or fleeting thoughts. The pages were heavily annotated with dates, exact times, and structural calculations of human weakness. The very first entry, dated 5 years ago, wasn't about love. It detailed a systematic, calculated strategy to isolate me from my peers, manipulate my design ambitions, and extract my talent for her exclusive control. The words blurred as the chilling reality washed over my exhausted body. Every single aspect of our perfect life was a meticulously engineered, structural lie. I turned the page and saw the name of the man she had completely destroyed. Sylvia had always positioned herself as the flawless keystone of my entire existence. When we first met, my career was dangerously close to a total, catastrophic collapse. I was a junior architect, drowning in a toxic partnership, constantly fighting for my creative life. Sylvia walked into that chaotic, dust-filled studio like a precision-engineered solution. She was sharp, charismatic, and ruthlessly organized, possessing an uncanny ability to navigate the complex, treacherous waters of corporate PR. She convinced me to break away, to form our own independent firm where my raw structural talent could finally be paired with her unparalleled management skills. And it worked, or so I completely believed. Our new firm quickly became the absolute gold standard in the city's brutalist architectural scene. But the division of labor was incredibly stark. I lived in the trenches. I spent my days on freezing, mud-soaked construction sites, the deafening roar of concrete mixers constantly ringing in my ears. I came home every night with drywall dust permanently embedded under my fingernails and a dull, throbbing ache radiating down my spine. Sylvia, meanwhile, floated effortlessly through sterile, glass-walled boardrooms and upscale, high-society charity galas. She wore immaculate designer suits, her hands always perfectly manicured and completely devoid of calluses. She controlled the narrative, the wealthy clients, and the massive financial accounts. I happily surrendered that control, deeply grateful for the heavy burden she lifted from my shoulders. I genuinely thought we were a perfect, symbiotic structure, two necessary pillars supporting a massive, beautiful life. I never questioned why she insisted on managing every single external communication, or why my old colleagues slowly stopped returning my phone calls. I was too completely consumed by the relentless, physical demands of the drafting table and the pouring schedules. I trusted her implicitly, viewing her as the protective shell around my vulnerable core. But as I stared down at the meticulously recorded entries in that heavy black ledger, the entire foundation of my reality began to violently buckle. The protective shell she built wasn't a sanctuary. It was a carefully designed psychological prison. The house was completely silent, save for the relentless, rhythmic drumming of the heavy rain against the massive, floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows. I sat alone at the cold, stainless steel kitchen island, bathed only in the harsh, blue glow of the under-cabinet lighting. I turned the brittle, yellowing pages of the ledger with trembling, calloused fingers. Entry after entry meticulously detailed the exact, horrifying mechanics of our early relationship. Our supposedly spontaneous first meeting at that obscure, downtown art gallery hadn't been an accident of fate. The diary revealed a chillingly precise reconnaissance operation. Sylvia had spent 3 solid months aggressively researching my daily habits, my preferred coffee shops, and my deep, fundamental psychological insecurities. She knew exactly what to wear, exactly what obscure architectural theory to casually reference, and exactly how to position herself as the ultimate, empathetic listener. Target is highly susceptible to validation regarding his brutalist concepts. She had written on a Tuesday in November, her handwriting perfectly slanted and utterly devoid of emotion. Requires an aggressive, stabilizing force to sever his current professional ties. I felt a violent wave of physical nausea twist my gut, a heavy, acidic bile rising in the back of my throat. I was reading the cold, calculated blueprints of my own emotional hijacking. She hadn't fallen in love with me. She had systematically acquired me like a highly undervalued, prime piece of commercial real estate. Every tender moment, every late-night conversation, every shared vulnerability was a calculated data point she had weaponized to build my absolute dependency on her. The psychological terror of this realization was physically paralyzing. I looked across the dark, empty expanse of our minimalist living room, suddenly acutely aware that I was sharing this isolated concrete fortress with a highly functional, apex predator. The mechanical hum of the massive refrigerator felt deafening in the silence. I dragged my hands over my face, the rough skin scraping against my jaw. I was utterly alone in a trap of my own design. I flipped to the center of the book and found the blueprints of a murder. The middle section of the black ledger was a meticulously organized graveyard of my former life. I stopped breathing entirely when I recognized the bold, capitalized heading on page 42, the Victor Protocol. Victor had been my best friend since university and my original architectural partner. 7 years ago, his brilliant career had violently imploded overnight amidst a massive, highly publicized scandal involving allegedly embezzled client funds and heavily forged municipal permits. I had been utterly devastated, eventually cutting all ties with him when the sheer volume of evidence became impossible to ignore. Sylvia had been the one who gently, firmly guided me through that traumatic separation, acting as my unwavering anchor. Now, reading her own cold, precise handwriting, the devastating truth hit me like a swinging wrecking ball of solid concrete. She hadn't comforted me. She had orchestrated the entire catastrophe. The diary detailed, step by step, exactly how she had gained unauthorized access to Victor's private terminal. It documented the specific dates she planted the fabricated financial discrepancies and the exact burner emails she used to anonymously tip off the city's licensing board. Victor's influence on Elias is a structural vulnerability, she had written in cold, blue ink. He must be completely eradicated from the professional ecosystem to ensure total control of the primary asset. The primary asset. That was me. I wasn't a husband. I was a performing commodity. The sheer, crushing weight of the guilt physically forced me to my knees on the cold, polished concrete floor. I had completely abandoned my closest friend, leaving him to professionally drown, based entirely on a masterpiece of psychological sabotage designed by the woman sleeping peacefully in the next room. I pressed my forehead against the freezing floor, gasping for air. The structural integrity of my entire past was a fabrication. I had built my massive success directly on top of the shattered ruins of a good man's life. But the horrors of the past were nothing compared to what she was planning next. I rapidly skipped ahead to the most recent entries, my heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. The pages here were incredibly fresh, filled with complex, highly technical structural equations and heavily modified CAD coordinates. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. We were currently in the final planning stages of our firm's absolute flagship project, a massive, 40-story luxury residential tower situated directly on the city's crowded waterfront. It was my magnum opus. But Sylvia's diary revealed a catastrophic, terrifying modification. She was actively, covertly altering the core load-bearing calculations for the tower's primary shear walls. Specifically, she was systematically reducing the specified tensile strength of the rebar grids on the lower 5 levels. I am an architect. I know exactly how physical materials behave under massive, sustained stress. If this building was constructed using her secretly modified blueprints, the sheer, crushing weight of the upper 35 floors would inevitably cause the base to violently buckle. It wouldn't just be a structural failure. It would be a catastrophic, pancaking collapse resulting in hundreds of casualties. And the diary laid out the sinister motive with terrifying clarity. Insurance payout on catastrophic contractor failure, $150 million, she calculated in the margins. Elias's signature on the final modified structural approvals guarantees total criminal liability. She was actively engineering a massive, deadly disaster to cash out a 9-figure insurance policy, planning to send me to a maximum security federal prison for the rest of my life, while she walked away the wealthy, grieving widow. The sheer scale of her sociopathy was paralyzing. I wasn't just fighting for my marriage or my stolen career anymore. I was staring at the mechanical blueprints for a mass casualty event. The smell of the old paper in the diary suddenly felt thick and suffocating, like the dust of a collapsed building. I had to stop this before a single cubic yard of concrete was ever poured. The gray, anemic light of the early morning slowly crept through the massive windows, casting long, harsh shadows across the minimalist kitchen. I had exactly 2 hours to meticulously rewrap the ledger, perfectly reseal the damaged drywall cavity with fast-setting compound, and aggressively scrub the chalky, white dust from my calloused hands. By the time Sylvia finally walked into the kitchen, wearing a pristine, tailored silk robe, the physical scene of my devastating discovery was completely erased. She smiled warmly, her eyes crinkling in that perfectly practiced, deeply affectionate way that had fooled me for nearly a decade. She poured herself a cup of rich, dark coffee, the ceramic mug clinking softly against the granite counter. "Good morning, my brilliant builder," she murmured, leaning in to press a soft, lingering kiss against my rough cheek. The overwhelming stench of her expensive, floral perfume mixed with the lingering, metallic taste of fear in my mouth. I had to summon every single ounce of my professional discipline to look directly into her eyes and smile back. I was standing intimately close to a monster who was actively calculating the precise structural failure required to bury me alive. The psychological tension was physically excruciating, a slow-burn torture that made my muscles scream with the effort of remaining perfectly still. I casually discussed our upcoming meetings, methodically matching her conversational rhythm, while my mind raced through complex architectural countermeasures. Every single word she spoke was a calculated lie, every gesture a tactical maneuver. I realized with terrifying clarity that any sudden change in my behavior, any slight deviation from my usual exhausted demeanor, would immediately trigger her predatory instincts. I had to remain the oblivious, overworked architect. I drank my bitter coffee, the hot liquid burning its way down my throat. I focused intensely on the physical sensation of the ceramic mug in my hands to keep myself grounded. I knew her digital surveillance was absolute, so I had to find an analog escape. Sylvia controlled the firm's entire digital infrastructure. She had unrestricted, administrative access to my emails, my cloud storage, and the GPS tracking logs on my phone. To reverse engineer her catastrophic sabotage, I desperately needed the original, untampered master blueprints of the waterfront tower, the ones I had drafted before she covertly corrupted the files. I couldn't risk downloading them from our compromised servers. Instead, I left my phone sitting actively on my office desk and walked 3 miles through the freezing, relentless rain to a brutalist municipal building downtown. I needed a ghost. I needed Oksana. Oksana was a gritty, no-nonsense senior archivist in the city's massive, subterranean planning department, a woman who operated entirely outside the modern digital grid. She smelled perpetually of stale tobacco and decaying vellum. I handed her a crumpled slip of paper with the specific project coordinates and a generous stack of untraceable cash. 2 days later, a heavy, unmarked cardboard tube arrived at a secure, rented burner address across town. I tracked the delivery using a burner laptop at a loud, chaotic internet cafe. The logistics were flawless. The package was securely routed through Nova Poshta, utilizing their encrypted tracking system that Sylvia couldn't possibly breach. I stood in the damp, dimly lit vestibule of the burner address, the heavy cardboard tube resting solidly in my hands. The distinct, industrial smell of the Nova Poshta packaging tape was the greatest scent I had ever experienced. It was the physical, tangible weight of undeniable truth. I violently tore the tube open, unrolling the massive, heavy sheets of drafting paper across a cheap folding table. The original shear wall calculations were perfectly intact, written in my own hand. I now possessed the absolute, undeniable baseline. By cross-referencing these clean masters with her corrupted digital submissions, I could mathematically prove her exact, murderous intent to the entire city board. But I couldn't execute this massive demolition alone. I needed to resurrect a ruined ghost. The meeting place was an abandoned, massive industrial dry dock on the absolute edge of the city's rotting shipyard district. It was a cathedral of rusting steel and crumbling concrete, vast and incredibly empty. The relentless, freezing rain aggressively slicked the broken pavement, creating a wide, cinematic mirror that reflected the heavy, bruised sky. I stood completely alone in the center of the cavernous space, a tiny, isolated figure swallowed by the sheer scale of the decaying architecture. 10 minutes later, a heavy metal door violently screeched open in the distance. Victor walked slowly out of the deep shadows. He looked 10 years older than his actual age, his face heavily lined, his shoulders hunched under a permanently damp, frayed canvas coat. The ruin of his once brilliant career was etched deeply into every physical movement he made. He stopped 20 feet away, his expression a hardened mask of deep suspicion and lingering hatred. I didn't utter a single apology. Apologies were completely useless in this structural failure. Instead, I unzipped my heavy waterproof jacket and pulled out a high-resolution, laminated photocopy of page 42 from the Black Ledger, the Victor Protocol. I silently walked forward and placed the heavy paper onto a rusted oil drum between us, then stepped back. Victor stepped up, his eyes aggressively scanning the meticulous, handwritten details of his own engineered destruction. I watched the profound, silent explosion happen behind his eyes. The hardened, defensive hatred slowly, agonizingly morphed into a cold, terrifying clarity. The air between us was thick with the visceral, palpable tension of a shared, catastrophic realization. He slowly looked up from the paper, the rain dripping heavily from his jaw. We were no longer former friends divided by a toxic lie. We were two deeply wronged men standing in the ruins, bound by a sudden, incredibly violent need for absolute justice. He finally broke the deafening silence, his voice grinding like crushed stone against rusted metal. I still have the old root access backdoor codes, Victor had rasped in the rain. She never bothered to patch the legacy firewall protocols I wrote. That night, at exactly 3 a.m., I physically infiltrated my own architectural firm. The towering, glass-walled office building was completely dark, a silent monolith of corporate power. I bypassed the main security desk, utilizing the subterranean service corridors I had personally designed, slipping through the heavy fire doors like a ghost in the machine. I sat heavily at my pristine, minimalist desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I booted up the heavy CAD workstation. Following Victor's exact, scribbled instructions, I initiated the complex sequence of legacy command prompts, aggressively bypassing Sylvia's sophisticated, heavily encrypted security partitions. The screen violently flickered, bathing my sweating face in a cold, clinical blue light, before granting me total, unrestricted access to her hidden administrative drives. I plunged deep into the digital labyrinth, rapidly sifting through thousands of meticulously categorized files. And there it was, a securely locked folder innocuously titled waterfront_final_submission_v2. I aggressively cracked the file open and stared directly into the terrifying face of the digital sabotage. The highly technical, structural load-bearing parameters for the lower shear walls had been systematically and deliberately slashed, by a catastrophic 40%. She had carefully manipulated the complex CAD algorithms to visually mask the fatal weakness in the standard rendering outputs. It was an absolute masterpiece of homicidal engineering, sitting silently on the server, just waiting to be officially submitted to the city's building commission for final approval. My hands violently shook over the cold keyboard. I jammed an encrypted, high-capacity flash drive into the terminal port, rapidly downloading the entire corrupted directory alongside the damning metadata that perfectly proved her authorship. The digital heist was perfectly executed, but the real danger was waiting for me home. I spent the next 3 agonizing days methodically transforming my hidden, rented storage unit into a secure, fortified war room. The damp, windowless space smelled strongly of cold concrete and raw anxiety. I stood before a massive, makeshift corkboard, aggressively compiling the overwhelming arsenal of undeniable truth. The physical scale of her sociopathy, when laid out linearly, was absolutely terrifying. In the center, I pinned the massive, physical master blueprints I had secured through the encrypted Nova Pashta delivery, their flawless, original calculations clearly highlighted in bright yellow marker. Directly beside them, I mounted the massive, printed stacks of the corrupted CAD metadata I had successfully extracted during the late-night digital heist. And anchoring the entire horrifying narrative were crisp, high-resolution photographs of the black leather diary, carefully detailing her long-term psychological manipulation and the brutal destruction of Victor's life. I was meticulously building an inescapable, titanium-reinforced trap, ensuring that every single possible exit strategy was completely blocked by cold, hard, physical evidence. I cross-referenced the altered digital timestamps directly with her handwritten diary entries, perfectly establishing a clear, undeniable timeline of calculated, premeditated malice. There was absolutely no room for interpretation, no possibility of her spinning the narrative or blaming a tragic clerical error. The sheer volume of the documentation was heavy, both physically and psychologically. I was actively, intentionally dismantling the entire foundational structure of my adult life, preparing to detonate a massive explosive charge beneath my own marriage. I stared at the dense web of red string and pushpins connecting the lies. My hands were completely covered in dark ink and chalk dust. The exhaustion was absolute, bone deep, but the adrenaline of impending justice kept my mind running at a terrifying speed. I was fully prepared for the final strike, until I made one microscopic, fatal mistake. The microscopic mistake happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. I had just returned to our sterile concrete fortress after an exhausting session at the storage unit. As I kicked off my heavy steel-toed work boots in the pristine, minimalist entryway, a tiny, practically invisible puff of white gypsum dust settled onto the dark hardwood floor. Sylvia, possessing the terrifying, hyper-focused observation skills of an apex predator, stopped dead in her tracks. She slowly lowered her glass of expensive red wine, her sharp eyes locking directly onto the white powder. "Elias," she asked, her voice dangerously smooth, heavily laced with sudden, razor-sharp suspicion. "Why is there fresh drywall dust on your boots? You were supposedly inspecting the foundation pours at the Southside site today. That's entirely wet concrete work." The ambient temperature in the hallway seemed to physically plummet. My heart slammed violently against my sternum, a massive spike of pure adrenaline flooding my system. If she realized I had breached the master bathroom wall to find the ledger, the entire trap would instantly collapse. I forced my facial muscles to relax into a mask of pure, dull professional exhaustion. I had to unexpectedly reroute through the old commercial renovation on Fifth Avenue. I lied smoothly, leaning heavily into complex, highly technical jargon to aggressively bore her into submission. The idiot subcontractors improperly installed the vapor barriers on the interior partition walls, resulting in massive moisture rot in the gypsum core. I had to manually rip out a section of the backing board to check the shear stud alignment. I delivered the technical lie with absolute, flat conviction, physically brushing past her to walk to the kitchen. I held my breath, waiting for her to push harder. But the dense, boring reality of structural engineering was the one thing she hated. She sighed, losing interest, and took another sip of wine. The illusion held, completely clearing the path for the most destructive day of our lives. The day of the final municipal board meeting dawned with a heavy, oppressive gray sky, threatening a violent, torrential downpour. This was the absolute critical juncture. The massive, high-stakes meeting with the city's elite investors and the municipal licensing board was explicitly scheduled to officially greenlight the construction of the 40-story waterfront project. If Sylvia successfully submitted the corrupted files today, the catastrophic trap was legally set, and my future was permanently destroyed. I stood in front of the massive mirror in our master bathroom, methodically adjusting the heavy silk tie at my throat. My face looked completely hollow, a pale, exhausted mask stretched tightly over rigid, unyielding bone. I checked my heavily encrypted burner phone one final time. Victor was already perfectly positioned inside the building's AV control room, completely locked in and ready to aggressively hijack the primary presentation feed on my exact signal. Sylvia walked smoothly up behind me, wrapping her arms securely around my waist. She looked absolutely flawless in a sharp, intimidating tailored suit, the very picture of a highly successful, brilliant corporate manager. "Today is the day we completely secure our legacy, Elias," she whispered softly into my ear, her voice completely devoid of the murderous intent I knew was burning inside her. I looked directly at her reflection in the cold glass, feeling absolutely nothing but a hollow, freezing void where my love for her used to reside. I gently placed my hand over hers, matching her chilling performance with my own dead perfection. "Yes, Sylvia," I replied, my voice a low, steady rumble. "Today is the day everyone finally sees exactly what you have built." I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, the physical weight of the evidence pulling heavily on my shoulder. We walked out into the freezing rain, stepping onto the massive stage for the final act. The massive doors of the boardroom swung open, revealing the absolute pinnacle of corporate power. The sprawling, glass-walled executive boardroom was heavily packed with the city's most powerful investors, zoning officials, and legal representatives. The atmosphere was thick with the distinct, metallic smell of expensive cologne and high-stakes anticipation. Sylvia confidently took the absolute center stage, flawlessly commanding the massive room. She launched into a brilliant, highly polished presentation, her voice projecting immense authority as she enthusiastically praised the revolutionary design of our waterfront tower. She smoothly clicked the sleek remote, preparing to display the final, catastrophic structural schematics to secure the official funding vote. I stood slowly from my heavy leather chair at the far end of the massive mahogany table. "Actually, Sylvia," I interrupted, my voice cutting through the warm, corporate air like a serrated steel blade. "I think we should examine the deeper structural foundations of this project." I violently pressed the hidden transmitter in my pocket. Up in the secure AV room, Victor instantly severed her connection and seized total control of the massive digital projector. The beautiful, pristine architectural renders violently vanished from the enormous screen. They were instantly replaced by towering, high-resolution photographs of the black leather diary. The very first slide projected page 42, the Victor Protocol, in massive, undeniable scale. Then, the screen rapidly shifted to the physical Nova Pashta master blueprints, brutally juxtaposed directly against her corrupted, sabotaged digital files. The bold, yellow-highlighted math clearly demonstrated the fatal 40% reduction in the shear wall strength. The absolute, deafening silence in the boardroom was physically crushing, heavy as a collapsed ceiling. I stood perfectly still, watching the terrifying reality violently crash over the executives. Sylvia stood frozen in the harsh glare of the projector light. The flawless, charismatic mask completely shattered, instantly revealing the raw, venomous, calculating sociopath hiding underneath. She lunged toward the table, but the massive doors violently burst open behind her back. The heavy boardroom doors violently burst open, and a highly organized team of federal investigators and municipal fraud detectives rapidly flooded the sterile space. I had anonymously forwarded the entire, encrypted evidence cache to the district attorney exactly 2 hours prior to the meeting. The horrified investors aggressively backed away from the table, their faces pale with the terrifying realization that they had almost heavily financed a catastrophic mass casualty event. The lead detective calmly stepped forward, loudly announcing the immediate, total seizure of our firm's digital servers, and the freezing of all associated corporate assets. Sylvia's pristine, tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. She violently turned to face me, her eyes completely devoid of humanity, burning with a pure, unadulterated, venomous rage that was utterly terrifying to witness. She didn't scream or cry. She just stared at me with the cold, absolute hatred of a predator caught in a steel trap. The authorities swiftly moved in, firmly placing her under arrest for massive corporate fraud, attempted insurance extortion, and reckless endangerment. The financial and legal uncoupling of our entire lives was incredibly brutal, completely sterile, and executed with absolute, unforgiving precision. The massive architectural empire we had supposedly built together violently collapsed into a pile of useless legal dust in a matter of minutes. As they physically escorted her out of the glass-walled room, her wrists secured behind her back, I felt an overwhelming, intense physical relief violently wash over my entire body. The massive, crushing weight of the invisible psychological structure she had built around me completely shattered. I was finally breathing free air. Victor silently emerged from the back corridor, his ruined posture finally straightening as he watched his destroyer taken away. We stood alone in the absolute wreckage of a massive, failed design. The legal storm raged for months, leaving me with absolutely nothing but a hollow foundation. It has been exactly 8 grueling, incredibly complicated months since the explosive collapse in the executive boardroom. The relentless, aggressive legal proceedings have completely dismantled our firm, officially dissolving the toxic partnership and sending Sylvia to a maximum security federal facility awaiting a massive, multi-year trial. I am currently standing completely alone in the raw, unfinished concrete shell of a small, brutalist commercial project located on the quiet outskirts of the city. There are no massive glass walls here, no corporate investors, and no manipulative PR managers. There is only the harsh, honest smell of wet cement, the physical grinding of heavy machinery, and the cold, unyielding reality of structural physics. The suffocating, deep psychological exhaustion that plagued my every waking moment for a decade is finally gone, permanently replaced by a cold, hard, and undeniable wisdom. Victor and I have slowly, carefully started a new, highly specialized structural auditing firm, meticulously checking the math of other architects to ensure no hidden weaknesses exist in the city's skyline. The deeply traumatic ordeal fundamentally changed the absolute core of who I am, permanently stripping away my naive, blind willingness to simply trust the surface aesthetics of any relationship or building. I walked slowly over to a massive, exposed load-bearing concrete pillar, pressing my bare, calloused hand firmly against the rough, gray surface. I absolutely do not regret the ruthless, methodical path I chose to forcefully detonate the lie I was living inside. I take a deep, cleansing breath of the freezing, dusty air, completely ready to finally start rebuilding my life. I learned the hardest possible lesson about the physical mechanics of trust and survival. The most beautiful, flawless structures can hide the most catastrophic, deadly flaws deep within their walls. A truly strong foundation requires absolute, unvarnished honesty, not a perfect facade. Never ignore the hidden cracks, because the final collapse is always sudden, violent, and absolute.